Hi, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the coolest little capital in the world, the place you can't beat on a good day. But those good days are getting further and further apart. The cracks are showing, and not just the ones in the ground. What on earth is happening in Wellington?
Let's Get Wellington Moving is the latest infrastructure project to be put on halt.
I don't know anyone in Wellington who actually supports the Let's Get Wellington Moving in its current form. Both the city councils and the regional council have agreed to put it out of its misery. It's been an expensive flop.
The government will instead fund and build a second Mount Victoria tunnel.
We need a second Mount Victoria tunnel. We'll make it an infrastructure priority, get on with it and start construction within our first term.
I think it would be fair to say 2023 commitments were very ambitious. Very ambitious.
The grand dame of Wellington venues out of action for a decade and now growing greenery along with a massive bill for quake strengthening.
Wellington City Council has hit pause at its Golden Mile Central City revamp after learning of another budget blowout.
Upgrades to Lambton Quay, Willis and Manor Streets and Courtney Place faced delays and budget blowouts since the project scope was first laid out in 2021.
The more ambitious plans to get Wellington moving have been shelved, and the new tunnel is seemingly at the bottom of a priority list in spite of shovels allegedly being in the ground. Every week there seems to be a new stink coming from a different leak in the pipes. But how hard could it really be to brighten up the central city with a few trees and new cobblestones? Well, too hard, it appears.
We know we need to frankly, tart things up in a lot of Wellington streets, particularly Courtney Place. If it's a Lambton Quay, we can do better, we need to. But we don't need to spend, and actually the final cost is going to be $215 million. We just can't afford that, so we've got to start again.
There's Wellington's Mayor Andrew Little last week putting the kibosh on the Golden Mile project. The spin-off senior writer Joel McManus said in December last year that Wellingtonians were so sick of infrastructure investment being cancelled, delayed, or stuck in endless loops of design reviews that they just want something, anything, to be built. So here he is with the outlook from the capital. I asked him about the elaborate and bold schemes that had become too over-specced and then are dumped.
Yeah, I think there's an extraordinary and long-term problem in Wellington, which essentially boils down to it's really hard to build anything. And by which I mean not just housing, not just private developments, but these bigger government projects. The Golden Mile being one, but, talking so much more about the second Mount Victoria tunnel, about the Basin flyover. There's just such a long track record of major projects in Wellington just falling over and not happening. The Golden Mile is the latest example of it, but I think it's also symptomatic of the wider issue.
Here's Corin Dan talking to Andrew Little on RNZ's Morning Report last November.
As a Wellingtonian, it does seem as though these projects keep blowing out. There has to keep being reviews. I mean, people are losing faith in these numbers.
Yeah, I think the worst thing would be to sort of just box on regardless of the numbers. So having seen what the numbers are, the right thing is to review it. But look, Wellingtonians will also be aware of the other big project cost blowouts we've had, the town hall and the sludge minimisation plant. But we're still, the previous council agreed to put an extra $80-odd million into that project. We're still trying to work out where we're going to get that from. So look, it seems to me there is something about the way we are contracting or estimating contracts. We've got to get to the bottom of that. But in the meantime, we have this project on our plate, and notwithstanding the very important objectives that it's seeking to achieve, the reality is the Wellington City Council and its ratepayers simply cannot sustain another massive cost blowout, and we have to look at it.
As strange as it is, I think some of it comes down to Wellington's status as a political town, by which I mean, there are many advantages to that, but you also generally have a lot of people who are very opinionated, very smart, and very familiar with the game of politics and government and working the system. And that does mean that when controversial things are proposed or projects that will upset some subset of the community, they really have all the skills and capability to stop that from happening if enough people are sufficiently motivated. Now, again, there are many examples when We celebrate people who stand up and stop certain developments going through their community. But I think what started to happen in Wellington, and what we've seen with what you highlighted already, is that when you oppose everything, you get nothing.
So the problem is there's too many politicians in Wellington, or people who know how to play the political game.
I don't think it's the politicians, actually. I think it is the latter, because we're talking about local politics here. It's not really an issue with Parliament or with central government as a whole, because we're talking about this particular city. Why is it that within the Wellington city boundaries it seems to be so much harder to get the big things done that you need to get done for a city to develop than it is in seemingly any other city?
Can we talk about the history of the Golden Mile project? Because it had its genesis, didn't it, in Let's Get Wellington Moving, is that correct?
Yeah, you could put it like that, and I think it's worth going even a little bit further back to the thing that really started Let's Get Wellington Moving, and that's the Basin Flyover. This is a proposal for an elevated highway going past the Basin Reserve. Now, this saw significant backlash. There were court cases, there were community protests. NZTA and the government and the local councils, I think, all sort of saw that backlash, identified the problem, that it's particularly hard to get things built because oppositional forces in Wellington are uniquely strong. But then their solution to it was to create this mega entity, Let's Get Wellington Moving, which in theory would be larger and more powerful and, you know, have a bigger mandate and longer foresight, and really take charge of all these mega projects and make them bulletproof. But that's not exactly what happened, as we know. Let's Get Wellington Moving has already been scrapped by the government, and in the end they essentially spent millions of dollars on reports, and they built one pedestrian crossing.
Wow.
So I think it's all tied together in the sense that the Golden Mile, part of the problem at its core was that it was overbuilt. It was more than it needed to be. We're talking $200 million plus for a street upgrade, which really could be done to half, 80% of the same standard for so much less. But it all comes down to the same idea of making these mega projects that would counteract these oppositional forces. But in the end, well, I guess what happened with Let's Get Wellington Moving was that it actually just became a bigger target. So anyone who was upset about any project took it all out on the entity itself.
So is Wellington actually stuck?
It's not. And I really don't think this is this is not a fatal problem. This is a temporary problem that we need public discussion about to solve. For example, we are seeing, Wellington has stalled for a while, but we're seeing growth, of course. We've seen some mega projects open up just recently. The new library, the new seawall and bike lane to the heart. This is an example of a city moving forward, and I think a really positive sign that there has been something of a cultural shift was the major change in housing policy a couple of years ago, which really opened up development permission, and so much of that was driven by young progressive voters in Wellington, which are that next generation of political power. So I think that itself shows that there is a bit of a rethinking about what it means to be a community advocate and what Wellington specifically needs to grow in this century.
Well, what does Wellington specifically need, Joel, in your opinion? Is it more trees in the street? Is it bicycle access? Is it quicker access to the airport? Is it prettying up? What are the issues?
I mean, I think. Well, we can talk about all of them, but the number one issue at Wellington's core is that it's not growing. The population has been stagnant, and as a result, GDP stays stagnant. So, ultimately, everything has to come down to increasing the population. You've got to attract more people to Wellington. That comes through business, but it also obviously has to come through housing. You've got to be a city that can provide high quality housing for a reasonable price so people have a good standard of life if they live there. You've got to provide the transport that enables that. And in Wellington, where the CBD is so core to the city's brand and the experience of the people living there, I think it actually is really important not just culturally but economically, to put up street trees and lights and make the streets nice, because you need to provide a place that people like being and want to be, both for lifestyle and for business reasons. That is really the lens in which I see Wellington's challenges.
But, Wellington used to be the coolest little capital in the world. It used to be, even the mutton birds said they wish they were in Wellington. And, it had that fantastic, vibrant theatre thing going on that you could, walk out the door of your hotel and you'd be in any number of fabulous cafes. I don't live there, obviously. Is it the same now, or have things deteriorated?
My assessment is that you've got a lot of people, a lot of talented people working really hard, trying to make it the same, trying to recapture that magic, but you don't have the same fundamentals backing it up. And by that I mean on the arts front, for example, in terms of developing young artists, young musicians. So much of that just comes down to cost of living. Can they afford rent? Can they get a part-time job in a cafe, afford rent in a cheap flat, and practice their craft? Because if they can't do that, then they're not going to be in Wellington when they're struggling away in their 20s trying to make it in the arts. They're going to be in Christchurch maybe, where it's cheaper. Even Auckland, the rent in terms of quality of housing is better in Auckland now. So for those young artists, life is a bit more difficult.
Did I hear a Wellingtonian compare Auckland favourably?
In terms of the rental market, Auckland is well ahead of Wellington now.
Yeah.
And that is another thing that Wellington, I'd say has to, but I think it is confronting, because it does understand that cities in the world compete for talent, particularly highly educated people, who are highly employable. They're more mobile than they've ever been. A city really does have to sell itself to those people, that the lifestyle is good, and the quality of housing that you're going to get is so important to that.
How much of this stemmed from the earthquake and the subsequent need to earthquake proof, the sending out of public servants to their hometowns far away, that kind of natural disaster resilience planning that has taken so long?
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it's something that's not really discussed enough when it comes to, the interesting and difficult malaise that Wellington has been in over the last decade or so. Is that the two earthquakes, the Sydney earthquake and the Kaikoura earthquake, really caused a lot of damage in Wellington, like an extraordinary amount of damage. But it's the little cracks, right? It's the damage to the foundations of apartments. It's the little cracks in the pipes. And so you never quite saw the level of full-scale disaster that you saw in Christchurch, for example, or that we've seen in other regions that have had major flooding or other natural disasters. That's why the library had to close. That's why the town hall had to close. And that's why, it's part of why we have so many water leaks around the city, right? It all stems to this earthquake. But Wellington never got the government intervention, the mass outpouring of support, the money that it takes to rebuild. And so a lot more of that has gone on the council and the homeowners. It's just a kind of weird, unfortunate situation where the earthquake was kind of stuck in this bit of causing damage, but not quite enough damage to get the full insurance effect. It just feels like something that the city's struggled with for so long, and no one really gives it enough credit for being the cause of so many of these issues. We've seen the issues that have arisen in the past decade or so from even just quite minor earthquakes. So if the big one comes, what happens? The reality is that there are plenty of cities that have grown and thrived in earthquake zones. Tokyo is the largest city in the world. It's in a highly seismically active area, so it's not impossible to do, but it does create that additional challenge of you've got to build the base isolators, you've got to do the extra cost in the building, and then insurance can be higher. So yeah, it is. It's an ongoing problem, and it's simply the ground underneath the city. So, it's not exactly like it can be solved with politics.
You've written a couple of really interesting articles for the spin-off. One of them suggests the left can't get anything done. Tell me about that. What's the basis for that? Because, of course, obviously the mayor now, Andrew Little, former Labour MP. What makes you think that progressive people can't make progress?
No, I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here, because this is not a broad criticism of the left or of progressives or of Andrew Little, but it was an observation that the issues that Wellington has in terms of not being able to get major projects done is actually quite common around the world in a lot of progressive cities. We see this again and again. San Francisco is probably the poster child for this. You know, they're the best known left-wing city in the US. Massive housing problem, nowhere near enough housing being built. Talks of high-speed rail, they take 2 decades and they don't get built. You know, they've had a lot of these same problems at much larger scale. But you also see it in certain other cities, Vancouver, Los Angeles. And one of the things that a lot of these places have in common is essentially you had a political movement, you know, around the 70s and onwards, which focused a lot on community protection, on environmental protection, and which saw large-scale development as negative. And there is, of course, need to regulate against environmental harms. But so much of this, which you see across the world, but especially in the Anglosphere, has led to a lot of the problems that we have today, right? Cities that don't have enough housing, cities with infrastructure that hasn't been replaced, you know, cities where rates are going higher and higher because they're straining under the weight of their population. And I think it's just an interesting challenge, which a lot of people have written about. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson being 2 really good examples about the way that left-wing cities need to sort of reframe their approach to growth and think about how do we actually achieve the goals in the future that we want to achieve. Because just saying no all the time is not going to get you there.
So do they need a bulldozer, a right-wing bulldozer to put all this through? I mean, I don't mean a literal bulldozer. I mean, you know, someone with a personality of a bulldozer.
I mean, look, Wayne Brown is an example of a mayor who has put that kind of approach into action somewhat successfully, right? And I think Andrew Little, to his credit, has done that a wee bit in terms of the way he's cutting through some council processes, you know, cutting through a bit of the bureaucracy, and you know, and is willing to sort of keep the officers in line. But the other way of seeing it, rather than the bulldozer approach, is the light approach. And for things like the Golden Mile, you know, for urbanism, street level projects, I wrote that I would like to see Wellington and most cities in New Zealand embrace that a lot more, because the Golden Mile never needed to be a $200 million project. We didn't need to rip up all of the footpath and replace all the pipes and move all the bus bays. You know, the street needs to be cleaned up. It needs to be renewed. We need some upgrades. But you could have achieved that by doing it small, incrementally, but taking bits and pieces out of it over time, rather than it turning it into this mega project that draws mega opposition.
What did you mean by keep officers in line? Because that's one thing you've written about, is public servants who kind of take the reins.
I think it's an interesting and under-discussed aspect of like political leadership. The way that a minister or a mayor has this staff of public servants that they can command, but they don't directly work for them. And there are skills and talents on both sides, but I think in Wellington, something that I observed under Tory Whānau's mayoralty, but also Andy Foster's mayoralty, is the way council officers and the senior staff really ran the ship a bit more than what we've seen under Andrew Little's leadership. You know, it can be good to take advice, obviously, from expert officials, but they're not directly answerable to the public the way politicians are. They don't have the same, you know, political instincts, and they can sometimes lead politicians down paths that suit the bureaucracy, but don't necessarily suit outcomes for the public.
What do you think is going to happen in Wellington? I mean, what has to happen, and what do you think probably will happen?
I mean, I don't think the Golden Mile upgrade is dead. I think an upgrade of Courtenay Place has to happen. And I don't just mean that because I think it's important, but I mean politically, Andrew Little will face quite significant backlash from progressives if he completely abandons this project. So he is going to need to come back to the council table, but also to the public with a new way forward. And there's officers going away writing up that plan now. Initially, they were given a year, which is potentially concerning that it is again going to become this kind of super project. But really, I think the public is going to want, at least, you know, the public who support the project is going to want some sort of design showing that the street is going to look a bit nicer quite soon and, won't cost $200 million, will cost significantly less than that. And that's not necessarily that difficult to get done, but no one's done it. No one's done it up until now. So I'd like to just see some progress.
How many reports have they had on this, and how much does it cost?
Oh, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Sorry, there have been so many that I've been covering this for 7 years, I think, at this point, and I've completely lost count.
Wellington Council will investigate some cheaper options to revitalise the city centre after councillors there voted 14-3 to kill the Golden Mile project. Debate over the removal of cars, the addition of cycle lanes soon dominated the headlines there, and then another recent review called into question the project's touted benefits.
Because there was one that was you described as being massively over-specced, $460,000 worth, 241 pages. It's like you're talking about gold-plated roads. That's a gold-plated report.
And this was just the report on whether to continue the project. Andrew Little had proposed pausing/scrapping it, and this report was essentially just to confirm whether that was a good idea or not. But I think it speaks to this culture of super bureaucracy that has crept in, that anyone thought that this was a scale of report that was needed for this decision.
But also some interesting calculations as to how that report came to its conclusions, changing the cost-benefit ratio and not including transport, just not including pedestrian benefits and things like that. Is this proof that the bureaucrats behind the scenes can engineer solutions and unsolutions depending on what is politically desirable? Well,
yeah, one could certainly look at this report and say that it led itself to a conclusion that it was supposed to lead to, right?
$215 million for the project, 50% chance it ends up higher. No sensible person's going to say, yes, let's continue.
Yes, but even within that, yes, I pointed out in my reporting that some of it struck me as a bit fishy. There are these calculations of the cost-benefit ratio, which has been recalculated many, many times over the course of the project, but the calculation that they came up with this time was much, much lower and discounted a lot of things like pedestrian amenity and public transport improvements, and they didn't include that in the transport benefits column. So, that doesn't necessarily mean that the project on a whole was a good idea, but I think the report itself was certainly leading in a certain direction.
Did Andrew Little do the right thing in pulling the plug?
Politically, for the position he's in, this was the only move available to him, really. It was not viable to move on. The only reason it had survived as long as it had was because NZTA had still committed to fund half of it, so it was still kind of a good deal for the council. But as the cost blew out more and more because of more and more delays, it had just reached a point where there was clearly no mandate for it. Cancelling it entirely would have been difficult as well for Little, so scrapping this version of the project and directing the officers to come up with a much, much cheaper version was the obvious choice.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Phil Benj and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Joel McManus. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite anō.